Before his scream shattered the silence of kings, before his shadow crawled across the hearts of armies, he was a man. Not a myth, not a wraith, a man. He stood tall among the sons of Númenor, that proud island kingdom gifted by the Valar to those who had fought beside the elves in the war against Morgoth. Beneath golden banners and white towers, his footsteps rang on stones shaped by wisdom and will. He looked upon the world with the clarity of high lineage, strong of body, sharp of mind, and burdened by a legacy that whispered both greatness and doom. His name is lost. No scroll remembers it. No song dares recall it. But the shadow he became, the world still trembles beneath that. He was likely born between the years 1500 and 1600 of the Second Age, during the reign of Queen Tar-Telperion. It was a time of mastery and splendor, when the Númenóreans grew mighty in craft and knowledge. The island bloomed like a jewel in the sea, a beacon of human achievement. And yet behind the bright walls and domed citadels, something else stirred, something quieter, deeper, and more dangerous. Dissatisfaction. The Númenóreans lived long lives, centuries even, but they were not immortal. And that truth, whispered like a curse in the silence of their temples and chambers, began to grow heavier with each passing generation. They watched the elves come and go, unchanged by time. They saw the light of Valinor retreat behind a ban they could not break, and in the hearts of many, resentment took root. Why must we die when they do not? Why must our time be measured when theirs flows without end? For a man of high blood, questions like these were not idle musings. They were obsessions, and in this particular man, this soon-to-be wraith, they became a fire. He did not age like lesser men. His life would stretch perhaps 3.5 centuries, but for all his strength, for all his stature, he was still a mortal, still bound to the gift of men, the gift he would come to curse. In his prime, he would have walked the halls of Armenilos, studied in the libraries of Ravenna, perhaps even stood among the captains of Númenor's great fleets. When Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, sent word across the sea in 1695, warning of Sauron's rising power and pleading for aid, the island responded with might. Great ships were launched, their sails white against the sun, and they broke upon the shores of Middle-earth like a tide of salvation. If he sailed with them, then he once stood in defiance of the very evil he would later serve. He might have fought beneath banners of honor, struck down orcs with a sword that gleamed with the light of his ancestors. He might have been a hero. But heroism is brittle when pride feeds its roots. The victory over Sauron emboldened Númenor. No longer were they just allies of the Eldar. They had become greater, stronger, kings of the seas. Their ships returned east again and again, not with gifts, but with chains. They no longer came to aid, they came to claim. And those who led these expeditions, those who ruled in the lands across the sea, were the hard-eyed lords of Númenor's colonies. It is among them that he is most likely counted. Not a king, for the throne of Númenor knew only one ruler at a time, and their line is recorded without gaps. But a lord, yes, one of high command, a ruler in Middle-earth, holding dominion over vast lands, feared and respected, clad in armor wrought from island forges, a torchbearer of Númenor's rising ambition. And it is there, in the lands he had conquered, that the hunger began to consume him. Not for gold, not for conquest, for permanence. He saw his domain, its towers and soldiers and walls, and he knew that time would take it all. The years would chip away at stone, the wind would erase his name, and death would come like a thief. And so he looked beyond sword and statecraft. He looked into older things, darker things, whispers of sorcery, fragments of knowledge buried beneath ruin and war. Perhaps he studied ancient texts brought from forgotten tombs. Perhaps he spoke to those who called on shadows. What is certain is this: when Sauron came again, not in chains, but as a giver of gifts, bearing rings of power in each dark hand, this man did not hesitate. He was not tricked. He was not misled. He knew, and he wanted more. Because for a man like him, centuries were not enough. He did not want to be remembered. He wanted to remain. The rings were not forged in darkness. They were born of fire, yes, but of fire kindled by desire, not malice. In the realm of Eregion, beneath the bright towers raised by the Gwaith y Myrdain, the elves sought not to conquer, but to preserve. They feared time, as all who love beauty must. They longed to shield what they cherished from the withering of the world. And into that longing stepped a figure cloaked in wisdom, crowned in false light. He called himself Annatar, Lord of Gifts. Fair to behold, gentle in speech. His words were honeyed with foresight and power, his knowledge vast and freely given. He spoke not of war or dominion, but of craft, of wonder, of preservation. And the elves, in their pride and their need, listened. They learned, and their forges burned hotter than ever before. Gold flowed like rivers beneath the mountains. Runes flared with secrets older than stars. Under Annatar's subtle guidance, Celebrimbor and his kin surpassed their fathers. They shaped rings, each one a marvel of will and design. Rings to heal, to protect, to slow the unrelenting tide of decay. But Annatar was not as he appeared. He was Sauron, and while the elves wove hope into their creations, he was binding domination into their very bones. For all the rings they crafted, save 3, were touched by his hand. And in secret, in the fire of Mount Doom, far from their sight, he forged another, a master ring, the One. Into it he poured his hatred, his cunning, his very essence. It was not simply a ring, it was him. When he placed it upon his finger, the hidden net tightened. Through the other rings, he saw, he heard, he felt. The bearers became windows, and he was the storm pressing against the glass. He whispered through the gold, not as a voice, but as an impulse, a shift of thought, a tilt of will. But the elves were not blind. They perceived the tremor in their hearts, the unease, the shadow curling at the edges of their thoughts. And with terrible clarity, they understood. They had not crafted tools. They had been bound, betrayed. In revolt, they cast aside their rings. The connection shattered. Sauron's plan, decades in the making, burned in his hands, and so he turned to war. He marched upon Eregion with wrath unbridled. The forges were broken, the halls scorched. Celebrimbor, son of Curufin, last of Feanor's line, was hunted through the ruins, pierced with many arrows, and strung from a post as a banner of despair. But not all the rings were reclaimed. The elves had hidden 3, Vilya, Nenya, and Narya, beyond his grasp. Yet the others, the lesser rings, lay scattered. And to these, Sauron turned his gaze. He no longer sought beauty or balance. He sought leverage. He saw in men what the elves had lacked: ambition without caution, desire without patience, strength without wisdom. And so, he offered them the remaining rings as gifts, not with deception, but with clarity. He did not need to lie. The truth was tempting enough. Among those who accepted were kings and lords, warriors and sorcerers. But there was one above the rest, whose hand closed around his ring not out of ignorance, but because he recognized what it truly was. A key to the door he had been beating upon all his life. He had ruled lands in Middle-earth, but time gnawed at his throne. He had tasted power, but feared its end. He had conquered, but could not escape the quiet dread that whispered to all men, "You will die." The ring silenced that voice. At first it came with strength, clarity, vitality. His enemies bent the knee. His words carried weight beyond reason. His very presence stirred awe and obedience. The ring magnified him, not just in the world's eyes, but in his own. He did not know, not yet, that the magnification would not stop. His soul began to stretch, thin at the edges. The world seemed less real. His voice echoed when he spoke alone. His dreams darkened. He saw cities he had never known, wars he had never fought, faces blurred by time, screaming into the dark. But even then, he did not resist. For power is not easily surrendered, not once it has taken root, and he had craved it for too long to let it go. The ring did not bind him overnight. It clung, it wove. Day by day, it sank deeper into his being, until the man who had ruled by his own will now obeyed another's. Not in action, but in impulse. Not in thought, but in truth. He would still speak, still command, still make war. But the origin of his will no longer lay within him. And in the distance, Sauron smiled. The ring was working, the man was unraveling, the wraith was beginning to form. There was no scream, no single moment of horror, no flash of revelation. His transformation was not sudden, it was slow, like rot beneath gilded armor. And that is what made it so complete. He still looked like himself for a time, still bore the same face, the same voice, the same proud carriage that once made men fall to their knees. But the eyes, those ancient, calculating eyes, had begun to change. They no longer blinked at the sun. They no longer softened with memory. They grew still, glassy, like something left too long beneath the waves. The ring had not just given him power, it had created a second hunger, a hunger for it. He could no longer part from it without pain. Not physical pain, but a dislocation of the self, as though something inside him had been torn out by the root. He kept it close, always, on his hand or pressed against his chest. And at night, when all fell silent, he would stare at it for hours, unmoving, unblinking, as though it whispered only to him. And it did whisper. The voice was never loud, never cruel. It was patient, familiar. It told him what he already believed, that he was meant for more, that the world was wrong to resist him, that there were no limits, only laws meant to be broken by those strong enough to break them. He began to forget things, first small details, names of servants, the layout of rooms, then years, then people. His own kin became strangers. His old alliances felt like tales told by someone else. The past slipped away from him, one thread at a time, until even his own name no longer sounded right in his ears. He did not resist. The fading was not unpleasant. It came with dreams, dreams of towers that stretched beyond the clouds, of cities bowing before him, of a kingdom beneath shadow where nothing could decay. His body became lighter, his voice carried further. The cold no longer touched him. He could walk all night without sleep or food or fear. But with each step forward, the world he once knew fell further behind. He no longer saw the faces of those who loved him. He no longer remembered why they mattered. Their warmth, their laughter, their humanity. They became pale things, ghosts that flickered at the edge of his perception, and then vanished. And still, he held the ring. By now, his form had begun to shift, only slightly, only when he wasn't thinking. His shadow would stretch the wrong way. His reflection would vanish for a heartbeat. Animals grew restless in his presence. Children wept without knowing why. The air grew thin around him, and in silence a pressure gathered, like the sky itself was waiting for something to break. He became feared, not through conquest, not by decree, simply by being. He would walk into a hall, and the voices would die. The hearth would dim. No one would meet his gaze. His own captains, men who had ridden to war beside him, bowed lower than before and spoke with strained smiles that vanished the moment he turned away. Some fled, others whispered. A few knelt too quickly. The man, the lord, the warrior he had once been. He was still there, but fading, like ink left too long in the sun. His memories became disjointed, his dreams sharper. The veil between waking and nightmare thinned. He began to see things. Figures that moved where there were none. Shapes behind the stars. Shadows that whispered in languages older than any man. When he walked at night, he felt them following. Not enemies, but mirrors. Echoes of what he was becoming. He no longer feared death, not because he had conquered it, but because it had already happened. Somewhere quietly, without a sound, the man he had been died. What remained was something else, something not living, yet never truly dead. His heartbeat slowed. His breath came only when he willed it. His eyes no longer wept, not even in memory. The world passed through him like wind through smoke, and still he remained, unseen to most, unheard by many, but always there, always near. A presence, a chill, a sense of something watching from the corner of your eye that vanishes when you look. In time, others joined him. The 9, bound by rings, bound by will, bound by fear. They did not speak often, but when they did, it was like listening to wind through iron. They did not rest, they did not eat, they did not forget. And among them, one stood higher. The others deferred without words, not because he ordered them to, but because something in him, something deeper, darker, pulled all lesser shadows toward it. His silence was heavier than their rage, his presence colder than the grave. And so, though his name was gone, though his past lay in ruins behind him, the title began to form, whispered first, then spoken, not with reverence, not with fear, but with inevitability, the Witch-King. There is no map for the path he walked, no road to chart, no torch to light the way. It was not a journey of miles, but of erosion, a slow, inward collapse of being. He did not descend into shadow, as one might descend a stair. He faded like a star, swallowed by dawn. At first, it was subtle. The world began to feel distant. Stone beneath his feet no longer held weight. The wind passed through his cloak, but no longer stirred his flesh. He moved through cities. He ruled like a man passing through a dream, touching things without feeling them, speaking words that echoed hollow in the air. His flesh was still present, but it no longer belonged to him. His body became a vessel, and the vessel was thinning. He would lift his hand to grasp a goblet, and for a moment, the cup would seem unreal, its edges blurred, its color dimmed, as if it were fading. Or he was. Sleep ceased to matter. His dreams had moved into the waking world. What he saw when his eyes were closed now bled into what he saw when they were open. Shapes moved behind walls. Voices spoke from stone. Sometimes the world would flicker, bright and real one moment, grey and spectral the next. And in those moments, he began to see what others could not. He saw layers. Beneath the face of the living world lay another, a realm of shadow and echo, where things long dead lingered, and the thoughts of men trailed behind them like smoke. He could move through this realm with ease, and the more he walked its corridors, the more difficult it became to return. His heart no longer beat with need. His lungs moved, but not from breath. His eyes burned with an inner fire that had nothing to do with sunlight. He no longer bled when wounded. He no longer aged. His form became fluid, shifting, slipping through light and shadow, depending on who looked and how. He stood before his men, cloaked in black, and they saw their lord. He stood before his enemies, and they saw something else. A phantom, a nightmare, a presence that chilled the marrow and silenced the soul. He had not sought this. Not exactly. He had sought to live beyond death, yes, to command, to rule, to endure. But he had not foreseen what would be taken from him in return. He had traded the end of his life for the end of his self, and what remained was something neither alive nor dead. The ring still clung to him. It was no longer an object. It had become part of him, lodged in the very essence of his being, like a parasite with roots too deep to extract. He could no more remove it than he could tear out his own shadow, and it grew stronger even as he grew less. The man who once ruled, who laughed, who wept, who chose, he was no longer present. Not entirely, but he remembered that he had once been, and that was the cruelest cut of all. For memory did not fade, not yet, not fully. He could still see her face, whoever she was, a friend, a sister, a wife, a daughter. He could not name her, but her eyes lingered, eyes filled with something he had long forgotten, light without fear. He could still recall the sound of gulls wheeling above Númenor's white cliffs, the salt wind, the scent of rain on ancient stone. These fragments drifted through him like leaves on black water, untouchable and mocking. He reached for them, but his fingers no longer closed. And then came the visions. Sauron did not leave him to fade in peace. The Dark Lord poured illusions into the gaps left behind. He shaped nightmares into prophecy. He showed kingdoms burning, armies falling, thrones kneeling. He whispered of dominion not yet achieved, power waiting to be claimed if only the last shreds of resistance were abandoned. And slowly they were, one by one. He no longer saw the ring as a gift, nor as a curse. It was simply truth, a truth that replaced everything else. It was his compass, his breath, his purpose. Through it, Sauron spoke. Through it, he obeyed. He had no chains. He was the chain. Where once he led men with banners raised and honor declared, now he moved in silence. Where once his sword bore emblems of lineage and pride, now it shimmered with spells of binding and fear. Where once he walked beneath the stars, now he walked behind them. Through veils of reality no living being could perceive. In the unseen world, he was terrible to behold. White flames danced in the sockets of a face no longer flesh. Silver helms glinted on heads no longer crowned by time. Grey robes flowed like smoke, and swords gleamed with enchantments woven in malice. They had no need for voices. Their will was law, their presence doom. And he, tallest, strongest, most empty, was first among them, the Witch-King, crowned not by gold, but by loss. He had lost his name, but not his purpose. Even as his soul thinned into shadow and his flesh unraveled into silence, his will endured. It was the last thing that remained, sharp, cold, unwavering. And it was that will which built a kingdom, not of light, not of stone, of dread. Far in the north, where the snows howl across blackened peaks and even the stars seem distant and cruel, he carved out a realm unlike any other, Angmar, a land where no spring sang, where the trees grew twisted and dark, where wolves howled not in hunger, but in allegiance. It was not a place one discovered. It was a place one felt, long before its borders were crossed. He did not rule it from a throne. He was the throne. His will shaped the mountains. His presence soured the sky. Rivers turned sluggish beneath his gaze. The earth cracked and ached beneath the weight of what he had become. The cold did not arrive with the wind. It came with him, always with him. He built no monuments to his power. He needed none. His kingdom was not meant to dazzle. It was meant to crush. There were no golden towers, no singing halls, only iron, only silence, only ruin. From this place of endless frost, he sent out his armies, packs of orcs bred in dark pits, trolls twisted by foul sorcery, men with eyes like dying coals who had forgotten they were men at all. And when they rode under his banner, they did not chant, they did not sing. They marched as if the world itself owed them fear. And it did. The free peoples whispered his name with pale lips. In Arnor, children were hushed with tales of his coming. In the woods of Lindon, the elves felt a chill that no fire could chase. Even in Gondor, far to the south, the stewards felt the weight of a shadow growing beyond the mountains. He did not conquer with speed. He did not need to. He understood time differently now. He was patient. Where others sought swift victory, he sowed corrosion. He let rot take root before the blade was drawn. He shattered alliances with fear, dissolved kingdoms with whispers. He was the unseen edge in every doubt, the unspoken dread behind every closed gate. And when he did strike, it was surgical. Cities fell not to siege, but to despair. Kings laid down their crowns not in defeat, but in exhaustion. No war horn heralded his coming. No drumbeat drove his armies forward. He did not need them. His presence was enough. The sound of his arrival was the absence of all others. Birds did not sing. Dogs did not bark. The world simply went quiet, and everyone knew he was there. Not all knelt out of terror. Some knelt out of desire, for his dominion promised certainty. No war, no famine, no betrayal, only obedience, only silence, only the dark comfort of never having to choose again. He offered that to those who faltered, and many did. His greatest victory came not by sword, but by corruption. Arnor, once the northern stronghold of the Dunedain, fractured beneath his gaze. Its kingdom splintered, weakened from within by his agents, until they stood alone, small, proud, and dying. One by one, he crushed them, until only ruins remained, where towers once touched the sky. But he was not content with conquest. He wanted silence. He wanted Middle-earth, not simply broken, but stilled. Still as a corpse. Still as the grave. The name Witch-King had once been a whisper. Now it was a certainty. He no longer needed to command fear. His name did it for him. He could feel it in the air when he moved. The way people averted their gaze before they even knew why. The way horses refused to ride into his path. The way even the boldest of warriors seemed smaller beneath his shadow. He had no crown of gold, no coronation of song, but he was a king, not of lineage, of terror, and his crown was dread itself. He no longer remembered the shape of his hands. They had once held the hilts of swords, the hands of comrades, the reins of steeds bred in the hills of Númenor. They had once built, written, touched, but now they were mist wrapped in gauntlets, shadows bound in armor. Their weight was illusion, their power borrowed. He moved now through a world not entirely his. The realm of flesh had grown thin around him. Trees seemed paler, stars more distant. He passed through doors without sound, stood in sunlight without warmth, gazed upon fire without reflection. His body had not perished, yet it no longer lived. He had become untethered, a thought wrapped in robes, a voice carried by will alone. He was no longer seen. He was felt. When Frodo placed the ring upon his finger, atop Weathertop, the veil parted. And in that breathless instant, the world glimpsed the truth of what he had become. A tall figure, robed in grey flame, crowned in silver malice. His eyes, once mortal, now burned with pale fire. His voice, once filled with command, now echoed with death. He no longer needed a face. His presence was enough. Where he passed, hope thinned. Where he willed, minds bent. Where he lingered, the earth cracked. He was no longer one of the 9. He was the 9th, their leader, their dread, their chain, bound utterly to the will of Sauron, yet so immersed in shadow that even the Dark Lord's command echoed through layers of frost and silence. He obeyed, yes, but with a will sharpened by centuries of absence. And when Sauron set the ring-wraiths upon the trail of the One Ring, he led them, unseen, uncloaked, and unrelenting. Across rivers, through fields, into villages where his name had passed into myth and fear had not yet taken root. He moved like a disease, silent until too late, but he could not be silent forever. Terror walks heavily. The world remembered him before it saw him. Horses bucked and fled. The wind chilled with no cause. People wept without reason. And when finally he revealed himself, towering and crowned, sword in one hand, dagger in the other, the cry of his presence shattered courage like glass. He did not scream to frighten. He screamed because there was nothing left to say. At the Black Gate, his wrath had once broken armies. At Minas Morgul, his will had once darkened the sky. But he would find his ending not in conquest, not on a throne, but on the battlefield before the walls of Gondor. There, in the hour of greatest pride, he lifted his sword high, and was met not by kings or captains, but by a girl. He laughed, and in that laughter was centuries of contempt. For who could challenge the immortal terror of Angmar? Who could slay a being that no longer breathed, no longer aged, no longer was? But prophecy is not bound by power, and death comes even to those who have escaped it. In his final moment, when the blade pierced where flesh no longer lived, he did not scream. He shattered, like ice under the weight of dawn. There was no blood, no cry, no echo, only a hollow collapse, a gust of wind where once stood a mountain. The armor clanged empty. The crown fell without a head to wear it, and the silence that followed was deeper than death. But somewhere, deep beneath time, beneath stone and memory and all the names that ever were, his story still lingers. The man who wanted to escape death. The king who crowned himself in fear. The wraith who became nothing so he could be everything. He was never seen again, but his shadow never truly left.